For decades, it has remained almost invisible. Its name rarely appears on the products people buy. Most consumers never search for it. Many have never even heard of it. And yet, every morning, millions of people begin their day with something it owns. They brush their teeth with its brands, wash their clothes with its products, feed their families with items connected to its empire. They trust familiar names sitting on store shelves, believing they are choosing between competitors, unaware that many of those choices lead back to the same corporate giant. At first glance, the marketplace appears crowded. Entire supermarket aisles seem filled with endless options, different logos, different advertisements, different identities competing for attention. The modern consumer is surrounded by the illusion of variety, but behind that carefully constructed landscape lies a reality that few people ever stop to examine. Because hidden beneath hundreds of recognizable names is a single company that spent years building one of the most powerful business empires on Earth. Its strategy was not simply to create products, it was to acquire influence, to expand quietly, to place itself inside households across continents without becoming the center of attention. While technology companies fought for headlines and social media platforms dominated public discussion, this corporation continued growing in relative silence, accumulating brands, customers, and market power at a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The numbers alone tell part of the story. Revenues larger than the economies of some countries, operations spanning dozens of nations, supply chains stretching across the globe, products reaching billions of consumers every year. Yet the most remarkable fact is not how large the company became. It is how effectively it remained hidden behind the identities of the brands people actually recognize.
This creates a question that goes far beyond business. How can one corporation own so many pieces of everyday life without most people realizing it? The answer is not found in a single acquisition, a single product, or a single executive decision. It is the result of decades of calculated expansion, relentless competition, and a vision that transformed an ordinary company into a force capable of shaping consumer habits on a global scale. But enormous size creates its own challenges. The larger an empire becomes, the harder it is to manage. Regulatory scrutiny increases. Public criticism grows louder. New competitors emerge. Consumer behavior changes. What once looked unstoppable can suddenly face pressures from every direction. And that is what makes this story so significant. Because this is not simply the story of a company that owns more brands than people think. It is the story of how modern corporate power is built, how it spreads into daily life, and what happens when a business becomes so large that its influence is almost impossible to see, even when it is everywhere. What made this possible was not a secret formula or a single breakthrough product. It was a transformation in the way modern consumer markets evolved. Long before this company became a global powerhouse, everyday shopping looked very different. Most products were regional, many brands were local. Consumers often bought from manufacturers that operated within a single country or even a single area. The market was fragmented, unpredictable, and highly competitive. Countless companies fought for shelf space, customer loyalty, and distribution networks that were expensive to build and difficult to maintain. As populations grew and international trade accelerated, a new opportunity began to emerge. Retailers wanted consistency. Consumers wanted products they could trust. Large-scale manufacturing made it possible to produce goods more efficiently than ever before. Transportation networks improved. Advertising expanded through radio, television, newspapers, and eventually digital media. The companies that could operate at scale gained an advantage that smaller competitors struggled to match. This created a powerful shift in the business landscape. Success was no longer determined solely by making a good product. It became increasingly dependent on distribution, marketing, logistics, and brand recognition. The companies capable of mastering those systems discovered something important. Once a customer trusted a brand, introducing additional products became far easier. Trust could be expanded. Reputation could be leveraged. A single successful brand could become the foundation for something much larger. Many businesses saw this trend. Few pursued it as aggressively as the company at the center of this story.
Rather than viewing products as isolated businesses, it began to see them as pieces of a much larger network. Every acquisition brought new customers. Every merger expanded market reach. Every new brand added another connection to households around the world. The company recognized that consumers rarely paid attention to corporate ownership. They formed relationships with individual brands, not the organizations behind them. That insight would become one of its greatest strategic advantages. At the same time, the consumer goods industry was undergoing a profound transformation. Supermarkets were becoming larger. Retail chains were expanding across regions and national borders. Shelf space became one of the most valuable assets in business. Companies that controlled multiple successful brands could negotiate from a position of strength. They could secure better placement, broader distribution, and stronger relationships with retailers. Size itself became a competitive weapon.
The opportunity was enormous because consumer products occupy a unique position in everyday life. Unlike luxury purchases or specialized services, these were items people needed repeatedly. Toothpaste, detergent, snacks, beverages, household supplies, personal care products. They were purchased week after week, year after year. Winning a customer once could generate revenue for decades. This created an environment where scale became increasingly valuable. The larger the company grew, the more resources it could invest into advertising, research, manufacturing, and distribution. Those advantages made future growth easier. Growth generated more scale, and scale generated more growth. A cycle began to form. But the most important development was psychological. Consumers often believed they were choosing between competing products. Different packaging suggested different identities. Distinct marketing campaigns created the appearance of rivalry.
Yet behind the scenes, ownership was becoming increasingly concentrated. Multiple brands that appeared unrelated were gradually being gathered under the same corporate umbrella. The company understood that visibility was not always an advantage. In many cases, remaining in the background was more effective. Customers developed loyalty to individual brands, while the parent organization quietly expanded its influence. Each acquisition added another layer to an empire that most people could not see. Over time, this strategy created something far larger than a collection of products. It created a system. A structure designed to occupy more shelf space, reach more consumers, and generate more purchasing decisions across more categories than competitors could easily challenge. The foundation of the empire was not built through a single dramatic moment. It was built through patience, scale, and an understanding of consumer behavior that many rivals underestimated.
By the time the broader public began to recognize the true size of the organization, it had already established a position that would take decades to build and prove extraordinarily difficult to disrupt. Once the foundation was in place, growth stopped being a goal and became a system. The company no longer depended on the success of a single product category, a single region, or a single consumer trend. It had created something far more resilient. Every new acquisition strengthened existing operations. Every successful brand generated resources that could be reinvested into expanding the portfolio even further. What began as a collection of businesses started to function as a self-reinforcing empire. The breakthrough came when scale itself became the company's greatest competitive advantage. Most competitors were still focused on winning individual markets. They fought for leadership in one category, one country, or one demographic group. The company was operating on a different level. It was building influence across dozens of categories simultaneously. If consumer preferences shifted in one area, revenue from another could compensate. If one brand struggled, another could thrive. The risks that threatened smaller rivals became far less dangerous inside a vast portfolio. As the company expanded, its relationship with retailers changed dramatically. It was no longer simply supplying products. It had become an essential partner. Store shelves increasingly featured brands connected to the same parent organization. Retailers depended on those products to attract customers. Consumers expected to find them. Removing them was often not a realistic option. This created leverage. When negotiating with retailers, the company could offer entire portfolios rather than individual products. It could secure better placement, broader visibility, and stronger distribution agreements.
Competitors selling only one or two successful brands often found themselves at a disadvantage. They were negotiating against an organization that controlled entire sections of the consumer marketplace. Advertising amplified this advantage. The company possessed resources that smaller rivals could not match. Massive marketing budgets allowed its brands to dominate television screens, magazines, billboards, and eventually digital platforms. Consumers encountered the company's products repeatedly throughout their daily lives, even if they never realized the connection between them. Brand familiarity grew, trust deepened, market share expanded. Research and development became another engine of growth. With enormous financial resources, the company could invest in product improvements, manufacturing efficiency, consumer research, and innovation at a scale unavailable to most competitors. It gathered data from multiple markets, observed purchasing habits across regions, and identified trends before many rivals even recognized them. Decisions that appeared simple from the outside were often supported by vast amounts of information collected across global operations. The result was a widening gap between the company and its competitors. Many smaller brands found it increasingly difficult to survive. Some were acquired, others disappeared entirely. A few attempted to compete directly but struggled against the advantages of scale, distribution, and marketing power. Every year, the marketplace became more concentrated. The company's influence spread further into households, supermarkets, pharmacies, and convenience stores around the world. At the same time, consumers were becoming remarkably loyal. Generations grew up using the same products their parents had trusted. Familiar brands became part of daily routines. They occupied kitchen cabinets, laundry rooms, bathrooms, and office break rooms. The company was no longer selling products alone. It was selling habits. Once those habits were established, changing them became surprisingly difficult. This loyalty created an extraordinary level of stability. Economic downturns came and went, consumer confidence rose and fell. Entire industries experienced volatility, yet people continued purchasing essential products. They still needed food, household goods, personal care items, and everyday necessities. The company's presence in these recurring purchases generated a steady flow of revenue that supported continued expansion. As years passed, the numbers became increasingly difficult to ignore. The company controlled dozens, then hundreds, of recognizable brands. Its products reached millions, then billions of consumers. Revenue climbed into levels that placed it among the most powerful corporations in the world.
Entire business schools studied its strategies. Competitors analyzed its decisions. Investors viewed it as a model of long-term corporate growth. Yet perhaps the most remarkable achievement was how little public attention the company itself received compared to the brands it owned. Consumers recognized logos. They remembered advertisements. They formed emotional connections with individual products. But the organization behind those brands remained largely invisible. This separation created a unique form of power. The company could influence countless purchasing decisions while staying outside most public conversations. By this stage, it had become something far greater than a successful corporation. It was an infrastructure of consumer behavior, a network connecting manufacturing, logistics, marketing, retail distribution, and brand management on a global scale. Its influence extended across countries, cultures, and generations.
New competitors could enter the market, but matching decades of accumulated scale was another challenge entirely. The empire had reached a point where growth no longer depended solely on expansion. Its existing position generated advantages that reinforced its dominance every day. More resources created more opportunities. More opportunities created more acquisitions. More acquisitions increased market reach. The cycle continued. From the outside, consumers saw shelves filled with choices. Behind those choices stood an organization that had quietly become one of the most powerful forces in modern commerce, shaping what people bought, what they trusted, and how entire markets evolved around its presence. For a long time, the company appeared almost untouchable. Its brands dominated store shelves, its supply chains reached across continents, its financial resources dwarfed those of many competitors. Investors praised its consistency. Consumers continued buying its products with little hesitation. From the outside, the machine seemed perfectly engineered for endless expansion. But the very strengths that had built the empire began creating vulnerabilities that were difficult to recognize from within. The first warning signs did not arrive as a dramatic collapse. They appeared quietly, hidden inside changing consumer behavior. For decades, scale had been the ultimate advantage. Bigger manufacturing networks meant lower costs. Larger advertising budgets meant greater visibility. More brands meant greater market reach. Those assumptions had been proven repeatedly throughout the company's rise. Then the market started changing. A new generation of consumers began paying attention to factors that previous generations often overlooked. They wanted transparency. They wanted authenticity. They wanted products that felt personal rather than corporate.
Smaller brands that once would have struggled to survive suddenly found new ways to reach customers directly. Social media reduced the importance of traditional advertising. Digital platforms allowed niche brands to build loyal communities without spending enormous sums on television campaigns. The company still possessed tremendous advantages, but the environment that had rewarded those advantages was evolving. What made the shift particularly dangerous was that many of the old strategies continued working well enough to mask the problem. Revenue remained strong. Major brands still generated enormous sales. Retail partnerships remained intact. Quarterly results often appeared healthy. There was no single moment that clearly signaled a crisis. Instead, small changes accumulated. Independent brands started winning attention in categories that had once belonged almost exclusively to large corporations. Consumers became more willing to experiment with unfamiliar products.
Some younger buyers viewed giant corporations with skepticism rather than trust. In certain markets, being small became an advantage. Being specialized became attractive. Being perceived as independent became a powerful marketing asset. Meanwhile, competitors were adapting. Some focused aggressively on e-commerce. Others built direct relationships with customers through digital channels. New companies emerged with lighter structures, faster decision-making processes, and fewer layers of management. They could respond to trends quickly. They could launch products rapidly. They could take risks that large organizations often struggled to justify. The empire faced a challenge common to many dominant institutions. Its greatest successes had been built through systems designed for stability and efficiency. Those same systems sometimes made rapid adaptation more difficult. This did not mean leadership failed to recognize change.
In many cases, executives saw the shifts occurring throughout the marketplace. The challenge was determining how much change was necessary and how quickly to pursue it. When an organization generates billions in revenue through existing strategies, abandoning those strategies can appear reckless. Protecting what already works often feels more rational than gambling on uncertain trends. That logic made sense. The problem was that markets rarely announce when a trend has become a permanent transformation. By the time change becomes obvious to everyone, the most important advantages have often already been captured. As pressure increased, acquisitions remained one of the company's preferred solutions. When smaller competitors gained momentum, buying them frequently appeared more efficient than competing against them. This strategy had worked repeatedly throughout the company's history. Yet even acquisitions began producing mixed results. Integrating independent brands into a massive corporate structure sometimes weakened the qualities that made those brands successful in the first place. Consumers noticed. Some became suspicious when once independent brands were absorbed into larger portfolios. Others questioned whether corporate ownership conflicted with the authenticity that originally attracted customers. The company was discovering that ownership alone could not automatically preserve consumer loyalty. At the same time, another challenge was emerging. The larger the organization became, the more difficult it was to maintain focus across every category, every market, and every brand. Managing an empire of enormous scale required balancing countless priorities simultaneously. Resources had to be allocated. Investments had to be justified. Strategic decisions affected thousands of employees and millions of customers. Complexity became its own form of risk. Smaller competitors could dedicate all their attention to a single category. The company had to oversee entire ecosystems of products spread across global markets. What looked like strength from the outside sometimes created friction internally. Then came increased scrutiny. Governments, regulators, activists, and consumers began paying closer attention to corporate influence, market concentration, supply chains, sustainability practices, and pricing power. Questions that once received little public attention became part of broader conversations about the role of giant corporations in modern society. The company was no longer competing solely on products. It was defending its reputation, its scale, and in some cases, the very business model that had fueled its rise. None of these challenges destroyed the empire. The company remained extraordinarily powerful. Its brands still occupied millions of households. Its revenues remained massive.
Its influence continued to shape entire industries. But something important had changed. For the first time in its history, size alone was no longer enough to guarantee future dominance. The assumptions that had driven decades of expansion were being tested by a new marketplace operating under different rules. Consumers were changing. Technology was changing. Competition was changing. The mechanisms that once created unstoppable momentum were becoming less predictable. The turning point was not a single mistake, a failed product, or a disastrous acquisition. It was the realization that the world that created the empire was beginning to disappear, and the company now faced the same question that confronts every dominant institution at the height of its power: whether it could reinvent itself before the forces that made it successful became the very forces holding it back. The empire did not collapse in the dramatic way many corporate stories do.
There was no single bankruptcy filing, no overnight disappearance, no moment when store shelves suddenly became empty. Its products remained everywhere. Its brands continued generating billions in revenue. The company survived. In many ways, it remained one of the most powerful organizations in the world. But survival and dominance are not the same thing. After the turning point, the company entered a different era. Growth became harder to sustain. Market share became more difficult to defend. Categories that once seemed secure became increasingly competitive. New brands continued emerging from directions that traditional corporate strategies had not fully anticipated. The company was no longer defining the future of entire markets as easily as it once had. Instead, it was reacting to forces that had already begun reshaping consumer behavior. The consequences unfolded gradually. Some of the most important changes were not visible in quarterly earnings reports. They appeared in consumer preferences, purchasing habits, and cultural attitudes. Trust was no longer built exclusively through massive advertising campaigns. Authenticity became valuable. Community became valuable. Speed became valuable. Consumers gained access to more information than any previous generation. They could compare products instantly, research ownership structures, and discover alternatives from almost anywhere in the world. The barriers that had protected large corporations for decades became less effective. At the same time, technology accelerated competition. Small companies no longer needed enormous distribution networks to reach customers. They could sell directly through digital platforms. They could build loyal audiences online. They could identify trends quickly and adapt before larger organizations completed internal approval processes. Entire business models emerged that challenged assumptions once considered permanent. The beneficiaries were not always the largest competitors. In many cases, the winners were smaller, more agile companies capable of responding to changing expectations. Some focused on sustainability, others emphasized transparency. Many built identities around values that felt personal rather than corporate. They captured attention not because they possessed greater resources, but because they understood where consumer culture was moving. The company adapted where it could. It invested in innovation. It restructured operations. It acquired promising businesses. It modernized strategies that had once delivered extraordinary success. Yet adaptation is fundamentally different from invention. The company was no longer operating in a world shaped primarily by its own decisions. It was operating in a marketplace where power had become more distributed and where consumer loyalty could no longer be taken for granted. That shift changed the meaning of scale itself.
For decades, size had been the answer. Bigger manufacturing networks, bigger portfolios, bigger advertising budgets, bigger acquisitions, bigger distribution systems. Those advantages remained valuable, but they were no longer sufficient on their own. The future increasingly belonged to organizations capable of combining scale with flexibility, resources with speed, and market power with constant reinvention. The story leaves behind a lesson that extends far beyond a single company. Every empire is built around assumptions about how the world works. Those assumptions create success. They attract customers, they generate wealth, they establish dominance. But eventually, the world changes. New technologies emerge, consumer behavior evolves, competitors discover different approaches. The very ideas that once created leadership can slowly become limitations if they are not challenged. That is why the most dangerous moment for any empire is often not its beginning or its decline.
It is the moment when success appears permanent. Because permanence is an illusion. Markets change, industries transform, consumer expectations shift, power moves. What seems unshakable today can become vulnerable tomorrow. What appears small and insignificant can become the next dominant force. History repeatedly shows that innovation rarely asks permission from established leaders before rewriting the rules. And perhaps that is the most important truth behind this story. The company that came to own more brands than most people could imagine demonstrated how modern corporate power is built. Its rise revealed the extraordinary advantages of scale, strategy, and execution.
Its challenges revealed the limits of those advantages in a changing world. Together, they form a reminder that every empire, no matter how vast, ultimately competes against time itself. If you enjoy exploring the rise, dominance, and transformation of the world's most powerful business empires, subscribe to Inside Tech Empires and join us for the next story.